And in this episode, I'm diving into Islam again, and we're taking a look at why it's growing so fast in America. If this is your first time here to FTD Facts, make sure you click that subscribe button as well as that bell notification so you'll be notified of future videos like this. And whether or not you're an old school FTD Fact viewer or a new school FTD Fact viewer, hit that like button on this episode. So let's begin with the history of the growth of Islam in the United States. Between the years 1878 and 1924, Muslim immigrants from the Middle East, more specifically Syria and Lebanon, they started arriving in places like Ohio, Michigan, as well as North Dakota and South Dakota. So like most people that immigrate to America, they were just seeking, better jobs, better work opportunities than what they had in their homeland. And history shows that one of the biggest employers of Muslim migrants was the Ford Company. So there was a lot of manual labor work for them to do. They were able to make American dollars, send it back home to support their family members, as well as build a life for themselves in America. At the same time, there was a great migration of blacks to the north, and this helped the African American Islam revival and the growth of the African American Muslim nationalist movement that of course is still alive and existing today. And this movement hopes to restore the faith and the culture that was destroyed during the slave era. During the 1930s and 1940s in America, Middle Eastern Muslims, when they started moving in, they started gathering together into small communities and setting up mosques to go and worship. However, African American Muslims already had their own mosques set up. They were doing their worship practices. So that continued for some time. Islam started to grow a little bit by bit. And an entirely new group of Muslims came from places such as Palestine. And several years before that, many Palestinians migrated to the United States. This was after the establishment of Israel. Also, immigrants from Iraq and Egypt started migrating to America. And in the 1960s, we saw a massive wave of Southeast Asian Muslims also coming to America. And Muslims also came from Africa, other parts of Asia, as well as Latin America. Okay, so that was a little bit of history of how the growth of Islam really started picking up in the United States. So let's fast forward it now to present day. Now I'm sure we're aware of the many different debates about immigrants in the United States, especially when it comes to immigrants from Muslim countries. But to really find out the amount of Muslims that live in the United States is a pretty difficult question to answer. Even though it may seem simple to answer, just any statistics anyways, it's always based on an estimate. But on top of that, the US Census Bureau collects statistics for housing, population, business, as well as the economy, government statistics, and information related to health, transportation, education, etc. But it doesn't ask questions about religion. So there's no official government count of the actual amount of Muslims that live in America. However, we do have a pretty good estimate based on the latest data that's available. The Pew Research Group, who's a private, non-profit organization, they're very reputable. Based on their data that they collected, they estimate that there's 3.45 million Muslims that live in America. And this is based on the data from the year 2017. We haven't fully gotten the 2018 data in yet, but based on this data, we see that Muslims make up 1.1% of the entire American population. So not that big at all. However, despite Muslims being a tiny drop in the overall population of the United States of America, we do see that Islam is growing and fast. Of course, Muslims in the United States aren't as large as other religious groups like Christians as well as Jews, yet projections suggest that in the United States, the Muslim population will grow much faster than the American Jewish population. And by the year 2040, Muslims will surpass Jews and become America's second largest religious group, next to, of course, Christianity. They also estimate that by the year 2050, the US Muslim population is projected to reach 8.1 million or 2.1% of the nation's total population. And now this is almost double what it is today. So why is it that in the next 30 years, Islam is going to double in population in America? Two biggest factors, according to Pew Research Group, of course, one is immigration. The latest numbers indicate that there were a total of 38,901 Muslims that migrated to the US in the year 2016. And that's actually 46% of the entire amount of people who immigrated to the US that year. So almost 50% of those people that immigrated were Muslim. Immigration plays such a big part in the growth growth of Islam in the United States because 3/4 of Muslims in America are immigrants or the children of immigrants. Now, there is another factor contributing to the growth of Islam in the United States, and that is the fertility rate. On average, the Muslim population is younger than other religious groups, so that means the fertility rates are of course going to be higher, more time to make babies, and they're having more babies. Now, one thing you gotta note that Islam in the United States is very new. Muslims since the year 1965 have arrived in the United States for 3 main reasons. And those 3 main reasons are, well, they were seeking refuge from the conditions in their homeland, as well as they're pursuing education. Third main reason, and this is the one that's getting a lot of the debates going in America, and that is that these immigrants want to advance the teachings and culture and customs of Islam into the United States. Although this number is a very small percentage of Muslims migrating to America, it's still a big topic of concern, especially with the Republican Party being in power in America, because 71% of the people who identify as Republicans agreed that they don't believe Islam is compatible with American values, and that's compared to an overall 42%. 60% also agreed with the idea that Muslim Americans weren't as patriotic as non-Muslim Americans, and this number was compared to 38% overall. As well as 56% of Republicans surveyed, they said that they'd be concerned if a mosque or some sort of Islamic center was built in their neighborhood, and this was compared to 33% overall. Now, even though the Muslim population is set to double in America in the next few decades, it's still gonna make up a small fraction of the population of America, especially when you compare it to Christianity. This is how the numbers look for the Christian growth compared to the Muslim growth. In the year 2020, it's estimated that the Christian population will be 252,970,000, which is almost 70 times the projected Muslim population. Now, in the year 2050, the projected Christian population will be 261,960,000. So as you can see, yes, the numbers are really large, but because of the growth of Islam and other religious groups, the percentage of the Christian population is actually on a decline. But still, even if Islam becomes the second largest religion at that time, that's only going to be like 2.1%. That's still nowhere near Christianity, although it's at a decline. But that's the big thing to notice. Christianity is decreasing, Islam is increasing, but there's also another group that really goes overlooked, and that is the people who are unaffiliated with any form of religion. It's estimated that in the year 2020, there will be projected 62,310,000 Americans who are not affiliated with any sort of religion. By the year 2050, the number is expected to grow to 100,860,000. So to summarize, the Muslim population in America is going to continue to grow, and in less than just a few short decades, it's going to be the second largest religion in America. But since, yes, Islam is very new in America, it's starting really from the bottom, but who knows how the religious makeup of America is going to look in the next 100, 200 years from now. Because in America, it's a lot different than places in Europe where a lot of people are converting to Islam, and although it does make up a small percentage of the population of Islam, we still don't really see that as much in America. It's estimated that 1 in 5 adult American Muslims were raised in a different religion and converted to Islam, and about the same number who were raised as Muslim no longer identify as Muslim. So you see, it's not really a factor impacting the growth of Islam in America. Now, the Muslim community is a relatively small community in all of Europe. However, in some countries like Sweden as well as France, the Muslim population is much higher. And this has led to a lot of social and political agitation in several countries in Europe. Even more so now because of the millions of asylum seekers recently. Today, the places with a Muslim majority in Europe are Bosnia and Herzegovina, Albania, Kosovo, Montenegro, and certain parts of Macedonia. There's also a large amount of Muslims living in Russia. Now, these communities consist predominantly of indigenous Europeans of the Muslim faith, whose religious practices and beliefs date back to several hundred years. And in transcontinental countries like Turkey, Kazakhstan, and Azerbaijan, they also have a Muslim majority population. Start by taking a look at why the Muslim population is growing so fast in Europe and will continue to grow fast in the decades to come. When we look at the year 2010 to 2016 alone, the Muslim population in Europe rose more than 1%, from 3.8% of the total population to 4.9%. And in terms of numbers, that's 19.5 million Muslims increased to 25.8 Muslims. Now, based on the current numbers, by the year 2050, the Muslim population in Europe would more than double, rising to 11.2% or more. And this depends on how much immigration is allowed in Europe in the future. Now, even if in Europe there was a Muslim ban where Muslims could not immigrate there anymore forever, the Muslim population is still estimated to grow to 7.4% in Europe. This is due to the high amount of youth that live in Europe who are Muslim, as well as the high fertility rate of the current Muslim residents. So there's a lot of young people there who have not had children yet, and when they start having children, populations multiply. However, in the year 2010 to 2016, the biggest factor affecting the Muslim population growth in Europe was migration. It's estimated that 2.5 million Muslims came to Europe for reasons other than seeking asylum. And these reasons include, finding jobs, going to school, and 1.3 million of those Muslims already have or expect to receive refugee status, meaning that they'll be staying in Europe. And then we look at the natural growth, which was the second biggest factor. In the Muslim community in Europe, there were 2.9 million more births than deaths during the period of the year 2010 to 2016. And then we look at religious switching, and it's estimated to be a small factor in the Muslim population change, but roughly 160,000 more people converted to Islam during that period. And I did touch on this a little bit, but the Muslim population of youth is a lot higher than other Europeans, as well as they're much younger. And on top of that, they have more children than other Europeans. In 2016, the average age of Muslims throughout Europe was 30.4, and this is 13 years younger than the average age for other Europeans, which was 43.8. So you can also look at it like this: 50% of all the European Muslims are under the age of 30, and this is compared with 32% of non-Muslims in Europe. And on top of that, the average Muslim woman in Europe is expected to have 2.6 children, which is one child more than the average non-Muslim woman, which has 1.6 children. Now, there is some concern inside of the Muslim community in regards to the new laws that are limiting them to enter the country. Some say that the new laws targeting Muslims bring us back to the times when innocent Jewish children were abducted and imprisoned to save them from eternal hellfire. However, it's not just the Muslims who are desperately in search to find more effective solutions that do not alienate Muslims or any other group of people based on their religion or country, but the fears are that history is just gonna repeat itself. Take, for instance, in 15th century Catholic Spain. The monarchy set out to solve the Jewish question, and they put a lot of restrictions on Jewish practices. Then they followed up with forced conversion, and the Jewish people were looked down upon because they were not considered Spanish citizens. By the next century, those who had converted to Roman Catholicism during the 14th and the 15th century, they were much more familiar with the Bible than the general Catholic population. And they began to set up a new standard which produced the Protestant Reformation, which resulted in the destruction of the Catholic dominance over Europe. Also, in Russia under the Tsar, they also tried to solve the Jewish question through discrimination. And of course, this caused a lot of Jewish people with great minds to join the Bolshevik Revolution, and it almost succeeded in the destruction of Russian Orthodoxy and culture. Despite these concerns that people have, the view towards Muslims varies widely when you look across Europe. According to the European Monitoring Center of Racism and Xenophobia, they report that the Muslim population tend to suffer Islamophobia all over Europe. However, the perceptions of views of Muslims may vary. And in the year 2016, the Pew Research Center, they conducted a survey in 10 nations, and they found that negative views about Muslims was actually prevailing in Eastern and Southern Southern Europe. However, the majority of people who responded in the UK, Germany, France, Sweden, as well as the Netherlands, they gave the Muslims a favorable rating. What they also realized is that the views about Muslims are tied to people's ideology. So there were 47% of Germans on the political right that gave Muslims an unfavorable rating, and that number was at 17% for those on the political left who gave Muslims an unfavorable rating. This gap between the left and the right is also seen in the countries Greece and Italy, and the gap between the percentage is about 30%. According to a WZB Berlin Social Science Center report that looked into the employment of Muslims in countries like Germany, France, and the Netherlands, as well as the UK, Belgium, and Switzerland, they noticed that Muslims in Europe generally have a higher level of unemployment, which is also greatly due because of the lack of language skills, as well as just a general lack of cultural connection and traditions, as well as the views about gender roles compared to other Europeans. This report also noted a very small percent of unemployment was because of discrimination. And the last thing I'm going to touch on about the various views that Europeans have towards Muslims is about their style of dress. This year, 2018, the Pew Research Center conducted a survey, and they found that most Europeans actually favor restrictions on face covering veils. An estimated 13 out of 15 favored banning of face covering veils in Western Europe. They see an Islamic way of dressing to not be representative of religious symbols, but rather they see it as repressive ideology in the form of Islamism, which is intended to influence families, society, and politics. As you can see, there are various different views that Europeans have towards Muslims, and again, these views are impacted by people's political standings and their own ideologies, things like that. And the issues and concerns that people have about this are the number of Muslims that are coming into Europe, the expansion of Islam, what is it going to look like for European culture in the decades to come, while others are saying we got to be inclusive to everyone, we can't discriminate or else we're going to repeat history. So let me know down in the comment section below, where do you stand on this? Are you for the acceptance of all religions and cultures and that people should be free to expand their religion and culture anywhere in the world? Or do you feel that in this case that the increase of the Muslim population across Europe will negatively impact Europeans' quality of life and be a threat to the legacy, culture, history, and a threat to the modern present day safety of the citizens? Alright, we begin this episode off at number 10, Dawah. During ancient times, Muslims used dawah, or inviting others to engage with the message of Islam. Prophet Muhammad, he preached to people individually, but as most of Makkah belonged to the elite class, they saw the message as a threat to their political, religious, and social and economic status in Makkah. However, despite the hostile position of the Meccan leaders, the message of Islam gradually attracted not only the weak and poor of Makkah, but many of the elite people themselves. After that, Prophet Muhammad began preaching the message and teaching the Quran, which made the religion spread. Islam also spread through Sufism. Sufism contributed to the Islamization not only in Central Asia, but also in Kashmir, a disputed territory in the Himalayas foothills with population of upwards of 95% Muslim. Sufism came during the period of the Fatimid Caliphate, and the Sufis started preaching Islam from the time of the Delhi Sultanate to the Mughal era in the Indian subcontinent. Sachal Sarmas, Baba Bule Shah, Shah Wali Ullah, and Data Ganj Bakhsh are some of the prominent Sufis who helped align the local values and the practices with Islamic teachings. Next, at number 8, we're going to be looking at the spread of Islam throughout Asia. Islamic groups maintained control of most Asian land for a long period of time. Arab Muslims spread Islam into Turkish and Persian kingdoms, which then expanded into Central Asia. In Central Asia, Islam gradually spread as cultures and ethnic groups mixed together. And now today, when we look, most of Central Asian nations are actually Islamic nations now. Muslims conquered part of South Asia from India to Bangladesh and began the Delhi Sultanate. Now in the year 1526, the Mughal Empire descended from the Mongolians, expanded the Muslim territory, and filled the southern Asian land with Muslim art and architecture. From there, let's talk about the spread in Indonesia and China. Most of Indonesia converted to Islam under the influence of the Sufis in the 13th century. Islam also spread through merchant activities by Arab Muslim traders and adoption by local rulers. And today, Indonesia has the highest Muslim population in the entire world. And that comes as a surprise to a lot of people because most people think that most Muslims are in Arab countries, but that's actually not the case. Either way, Islam reached China also during the Tang and Song dynasties from 618 to 1279 via the overland and the maritime Silk Roads. Arabian and Persian traders built tombs and mosques combining traditional Arab and Chinese architectures, intermarried with local Chinese, and also raised the first generation of Chinese-speaking Muslims. However, only 2% of China's population is Muslim today. Alright, for number 6, let's look at the spread of Islam in Africa. Islam entered Africa from different places. First, Arab traders came from Asia into North Africa and moved through the Sahara to West Africa. The first African converts to Islam were merchants in Sudan, followed by some kings and their royal courts. However, the peasants initially maintained their local faiths and converted after some time to Islam. Gao was the first place where the king of Ghana converted, and then Muslims established a kingdom in Mali from the 13th century to the 15th century. Mansa Musa was the king of Mali, and he built the capital city called Timbuktu, where Muslim scholars taught and wrote Islamic law. For fact number 5, I gotta mention Ibn Battuta. Cities developed in the places where African traders met Arab traders, and as the towns grew, the Muslims started building mosques to give the cities some shape. Now, the records about the spread came from Arab sources, such as the great Arab traveler Ibn Battuta, who traveled from Western Africa to Eastern China throughout his life, probably more than Marco Polo or any other explorer at that time. Now, let's look at the rise of Islam over in Europe. Islam expanded in the Caucasus through the Muslim conquest of Persia in the 7th century and entered southern Europe through the expansion of the Umayyad conquest of Hispania in the 8th to 10th centuries. Muslim political entities, they existed firmly in what is today Spain, Portugal, Sicily, and Malta during the Middle Ages. And the Ottoman Empire, they further expanded into southeastern Europe, and it consolidated its political power by invading and conquering huge portions of the Serbian Empire, the Bulgarian Empire, as well as all of the remaining territories of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries. Many Muslims also migrated to Western Europe in the late 20th century, as well as the early 21st century. And that actually leads us to number 3, migration. Migration, both forced and voluntary, has played an important role in the spread of Islam. The earliest presence of Muslims outside of Arabia was a group of Muslims who sought refuge in Abyssinia during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad. This is one of the very famous stories about the life of Prophet Muhammad. Similarly, forced migration brought the first Muslims to the New World through the transatlantic slave trade, laying the foundations for an early Muslim presence in the Americas. The forced migrants became distant from Islam, but then they returned to mainstream Islam en masse, starting in the late 1970s. Also, intermarriage between Muslims and non-Muslims also became a source of the spread of Islam in different parts of the world. One prominent case was that of Sarah, the daughter of Alamund of the Visigothic royal family. Now, she was married twice to prominent Muslims, and in later centuries her descendants formed some of the leading Muslim families of Seville, including the Banu Hajjaj and the Banu Maslama. Similar marriages happened in the Ottoman Empire and in India and also the United States, where Muslims married non-Muslims, and it gave rise to Islam in various different regions. Now we end this episode off with number 1, conquests. Islam spread through the reign of the second Caliph Umar, who held power from 634 to 644. And the Rashidun Caliphate constructed a massive empire out of many swift military victories and gave rise to people embracing the religion of Islam. After the Rashidun, the Umayyad dynasty and the Abbasid dynasty helped increase the conversion to Islam. The Umayyads did not actively encourage conversion, but when the Abbasids rebelled and gained control, Islamic art and culture started to flourish in the land, and they are famous for initiating the Islamic Golden Age. New projections by the Pew Research Center shows that factors such as fertility rates, as well as the size of the youth populations among the world's major religions, as well as people switching from one faith to another, is going to really determine which religion is going to grow the fastest. And if current trends continue over the next 4 decades, well, even though Christianity will continue to remain as the largest religious group, Islam will grow faster than any other religion in the entire world. So as of the year 2010, Christianity was by far the world's largest religion with an estimated 2.2 billion followers, which was nearly a third of the globe's population. And then in second place was Islam at 1.6 billion followers. Now, when we look at the projections by the year 2050, the number of Muslims will nearly equal the number of Christians all around the world. And then when we look at Europe, Muslims will make up 10% of the overall population. And then finally in the United States, Christians will decline from more than 3/4 of the population to 2/3 of the population in the year 2050. However, Muslims will be more numerous in the US than people who identify with Jewish religion. Now, these projections take into account a few things. First, the current size and geographic distribution of the world's major religions, as well as age difference, fertility, and mortality rates. But what is the real reason why Islam is growing so fast? Well, to answer this question, I want to look at 4 things. So first off, globally, Muslims have the highest fertility rate, an average of 3.1 children per woman who gives birth. Muslims have more children than members of the 7 other major religions in the world. And the second thing to take note of is another important thing that determines the growth is the age distribution of each religious group. So from the year 2010, a high percent of Muslims, about 34% of them, were younger than the age of 15, which means that Muslims had a higher youth population than any other religion, which is why Muslims are projected to grow faster than the world's overall population. Yeah, that is crazy. And the third thing I want to look at is international migration. So international migration is also going to impact the Muslim population. Using data from previous migration patterns, we see that Muslims are expected to increase from 5.9% in 2010 to 10.2% in the year 2050 in Europe alone. And now the fourth and final thing. By the year 2050, Muslims are expected to make up more than 50% of the population in 51 countries around the world. We also see that the Republic of Macedonia and Nigeria are projected to gain Muslim majorities by that time. Meanwhile, religious switching, or people that have changed faith to another faith, this is expected to hinder the growth of Christianity by an estimated 72 million between the years 2015 to the year 2060. However, this is not expected to have a negative net impact on the Muslim population and growth all around the world. So based on all these factors, in the year 2050, yes, Islam would be the largest religion on the planet.